Nearly a full year after the 1D&D playtest began, we finally get to see the first revision of the Monk class for the upcoming 2024 release, and man, was that not worth the wait. In fairness, I don't think that the 1D&D Monk is necessarily bad. I think there's a lot in the playtest document that suggests that the team is moving in the right direction, all of which we will discuss, but much like a lot of other first passes on classes, it seems that Wizards of the Coast missed the mark here by a sizable margin. Before I get into my discussion of the changes made with the Monk class, I want to just quickly comment on my overall impressions of the newest Unearthed Arcana 6 for the Player's Handbook. In large part, I think that the design team is actually moving in a really good direction. I'm not going to say that things are perfect and that they couldn't be better, but we are really starting to get a much clearer understanding of the overall design direction that the team is taking, which is to say that they are trying to make classes feel more true to their identity, provide interesting choices, and make the game generally more accessible. Whether or not they were successful on achieving these goals is a topic for another video. Though I have admittedly not pored over the document in immense detail as of yet, my first impressions of it are largely positive. Like I said in my last video, I think the idea of major overhauls are firmly out the window. This is certainly going to be more of an iterative release than I think some were expecting, but again, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. There's just so much to discuss in this UA, so please let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see me discuss next. The Monk to me in this release is really just a mixed bag of good, bad, and kind of meh. Like I touched on earlier, it feels like so many of the right ideas are there, it's just in the timings and execution that miss the mark. The good news, in that respect at least, is that with a little bit of fine tuning, these are the kinds of problems that can be resolved in a revision or two, so hopefully the team is listening. When it comes to design, the Monk has always felt like an outlier in 5th edition. Almost like a forgotten class that just sort of got thrown in at the last minute. What's always been weird to me about it is that it feels like the kind of class which should have been so incredibly easy to give an identity of its own to and truly distinguish it from the other classes in the game. But instead, it always felt like it was tripping over itself with disjointed features and too many competing attributes, one of the most broken and frustrating abilities in the game, mixed with some of the lowest damage output. Simply, the class never really made a lot of sense, and amazingly, in this rework, it feels like the team has actually identified many of the core issues of the class, but have instead opted to fix things when they are no longer nearly as problematic. To start off, let's talk about a few of the weird inconsistencies that just don't make much sense to me. The first thing we're presented with in the Monk section of this UA is a line telling us that the primary abilities for the class are Dexterity and Wisdom. Let's talk about that. The Monk is among the most ability-stretched classes in the game, and your effectiveness of the class is largely a function of how your ability scores are determined. This is not the case with most other classes. While it is obviously true that having higher ability scores will make any class better, that's just it. It makes them a little bit better. The Monk instead relies on reasonable rolls across the board for functionality. Firstly, you're granted proficiency in strength saving throws, not wisdom, which is an interesting choice. Next, of the 6 abilities you get to choose from to have proficiency in, only one of them, insight, is wisdom based. You're offered more intelligence based skills here than wisdom. It's confusing. Next, you only have a D8 for your hit dice, which has always felt way too low. I feel like it should be at least a D10 and probably even a D12, especially when you consider that this class is entirely essentially engineered to be a frontline attacker in melee range most of the time, which also makes your constitution score extremely important. If you decide to take advantage of the unarmored defense feature, you're then also relying on both your dexterity and wisdom modifiers. To double down, your class DC for your discipline powered features are also based off your wisdom modifier. But then, to add some more complications, with the rules for unarmed strikes, which the entire class is mainly built around, you have the option to grapple or shove creatures, the DCs for which are based off of your strength modifier. And sure, on the one hand, I can hear the argument saying that you don't need to be good at everything, you just have to decide which direction you want to take your build, but I'll be honest, I don't buy that explanation. There is a fundamental disconnect between the apparent design approach being taken in 1D&D more broadly and what the design team is asking Monk players to do. The designers speak at length about wanting features to feel useful and reliable, and being able to truly embody and embrace the identity of the class, and I feel like they've almost gone out of their way to make that challenging to accomplish as a monk. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it feels at odds with both what we're being told and with the treatment that the other classes are receiving. To be an effective monk that can reliably use all of the tools that have been provided to it within its base class, you need to prioritize wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and strength. It almost feels unfair. To be clear though, this isn't a problem unique to the 1D&D version of this class, it's just unfortunate that it hasn't been addressed seemingly at all. I also really like the idea of the monk being wisdom based, it really emphasizes the mind to body connection for me. It's just hard to reconcile it with the rest of the game mechanics. Alright, so I spent way more time discussing that than I expected to, so let's just move on. The martial arts die gets a buff now spanning a d6 to a d12 rather than a d4 to a d10. Not a massive difference, but a welcome improvement nonetheless. Another nice improvement is that monks now also receive the weapon mastery feature that we saw implemented in the previous Unearthed Arcana. The only problem is that it does not apply to unarmed strikes, which just feels like a massive missed opportunity. Jeremy Crawford spoke at length in the reveal video about how the design team is aware of the low damage output of the monk and how they want to address that, and while they are helping to achieve that goal through things like larger martial arts dice and weapon masteries, every other martial class also received large damage increases and can also use weapon masteries, so the delta between the monk and the other martial classes is seemingly remaining quite large. Ki has been renamed to Discipline. It has essentially the same function. Step of the Wind did get a nice buff though, to allow you now to both dash and disengage when you use it, and double your jump distance. Not that many people were really jumping to begin with. The bigger issue here is the apparent loss of the mobile feat from One D&D, which was extremely relevant for monk survivability. With the mobile feature not being present, a monk will likely need to dedicate a sizable portion of their discipline points towards defensive moves like Patient Defense or Step of the Wind, only exacerbating the key starvation that existed in 5th edition. At first glance, the new version of Deflect Missiles actually seems like a great change. It functions nearly identically to the old one, except no longer has the requirement for the ammunition to be able to fit in your hand, the short range of 20 feet has been removed, and it now applies to any creature within a 60-foot range. The problems arise with the fact that it is no longer an attack roll, but rather relies on a dexterity save, which will only become less and less reliable as time goes on, especially with how competitive monk stats are. Combine this with the fact that it's also not a half damage save, it's all or nothing. So you can expend your reaction and a discipline point to protect yourself from really just a small amount of damage. The upgraded version, Deflect Energy, which arrives at 13th level, while still not great, is actually deceptively good at the same time, depending on some circumstances. Yes, it is true that by the time you're a 13th level character, the creatures you'll be fighting are more likely to be forcing saves rather than making attack rolls for spells, but something that is important to keep in mind is that since the release of Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse last year, many spellcasters have had a number of their spells converted into spell attacks in their stat blocks, which can be deflected with this feature. So what this means is that the effectiveness of the feature is now a function of which version of the monsters your DM is running. This also nearly entirely undermines the promise of backwards compatibility for the class, as this 13th level feature is functionally useless if your DM isn't using post Monsters of the Multiverse creatures. The monk's new 7th level feature, Heightened Metabolism, is exactly what the class needed, just not at 7th level. Ki, or Discipline Starvation, has been a bit of a glaring issue for the class since its inception, and by the time that they received this feature, it's getting to the point where the issue has nearly sorted itself out. If Heightened Metabolism arrived at 2nd level, or maybe even 3rd, this would go a long way to enhancing the class's survivability and their effectiveness in combat. Now let's talk about the big elephant in the room, Stunning Strike. This feature has been the bane of DMs for nearly a decade now, and I don't think I would be alone in saying that it was among the most unhealthy features in all of 5th edition. Truthfully, even when I played a monk, I hated using it. Sure, it's fun the first few times, but I always felt like it just took the air out of the room sometimes when you got lucky and the target is just permanently stunned. It turned combat into really nothing more than a boring slugfest when it worked, and since you were able to use it with each hit, there's a good chance that you were going to land it at least once. Frankly, I feel as though the feature should have been removed entirely, but since it's been reworked, let's just talk about that instead. The overall functionality of the feature is the same, but there are a couple of key differences. Firstly, it can now only be used once per turn. This is probably a good thing for the game. The problem is that it took one of the few things that monks were good at, even though I hated it, and made it less likely to work. Secondly, the wording also allows for Stunning Strike to be used with ranged attacks now. I'm not sure whether this was actually intentional or not, but as the feature functions when you make an unarmed strike or attack with a simple weapon, any of the ranged simple weapons are also included. So you could potentially Stunning Strike from 320 feet with a crossbow, which distinctly does not feel very monk-like to me. As I mentioned, I kind of wish they had opted to just remove the feature entirely and replace it with something else. I don't really know what, but perhaps something in a similar vein that inflects some sort of status condition, but maybe not one that feels so swingy and detrimental to the overall health of the game. Lastly, I want to touch on the new 20th level feature, Defy Death. As an aside, I'm loving that most classes seem to have real capstone features now. I am a huge fan of that. As for Defy Death, like Heightened Metabolism, it just feels like its arrival is far too late to be of any significance to the class. Monks were too squishy, and Wizards of the Coast recognized that, but decided to address it at 20th level, where next to no one will get to use it, rather than earlier in their progression, where it could have actually been useful. At the end of the day, it feels to me that Wizards of the Coast just doesn't really know what they want to do with the Monk class. What's really unfortunate is that the class was seemingly left out of the initial, more experimental phase of testing, and is now only making its first appearance when most other classes are being revised. I'm hopeful that this won't have too much of a detrimental impact on the final version of the class, but we'll have to wait and see. It really just kind of feels like they've finally been able to identify many of the core issues that people had with the class, but just decided to actually solve them way too late. That, combined with the extreme competitiveness of ability scores, make the class feel disjointed and confusing. The ideas are there, the understanding feels there, but the execution is still leaving a lot to be desired. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Let me know what you think about this version of the Monk, and which part of this UA you'd like me to discuss in my next video. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, as it really helps other people find my content, but otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and take care.